Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue now and add some actual highlights, some lighting into the scene. So as you can see, I've got all my layers sort of worked out into groups, really organized. And what I'm going to be doing is mainly focusing on adding some highlights to the main objects in the scene. So things like the tree and the rocks and the bush and the hills and everything. So I'm going to start off with the clouds, and basically you can see we've already got a little bit of shading there from the texture that I added, and what I want to do is use a pure white for these clouds rather than a yellow, and that's why, as I mentioned before, I used an off-white color for the actual clouds themselves. So I've added a layer above my cloud group and renamed it. And what I'm going to be doing is just using a brush and brushing some white onto these clouds. I'm working out sort of where to place that. So in essence, I'm going to place the highlights on any sections of the clouds that are facing towards the sun. So this cloud that wraps around is going to have it sort of running sort of in this pattern that you can see here. And I'm just running it along the edges there and adding a little bit of overlap and some additional shapes in there just to give the cloud a little bit more detail and three-dimensionality. And then as I move across the page with the other three cloud groups, I'm applying once again that lighting, that highlight to the sections of the cloud that would face directly the sun. Any sections that would have other parts of the cloud in between the sun and the part that I'm painting basically would not receive any highlights. It would actually receive some shadow, technically speaking. So I'm just going through and just cleaning some of that line work up. You can also play around with the blending modes once again, just to add some subtlety and some slight variation so you're not getting a solid white or whatever color you're using. So I'm just making some adjustments there. And so the process is essentially repeated throughout all of the different objects on the image. What you want to do is basically work out what direction the light source is coming from, and then working out which surfaces of each of the objects is facing that light source, and whether or not that surface is also visible to the viewer, like from the camera angle that we're looking at. So you would see a little edge highlight based on those properties. So now what I'm doing is working my way forward in the scene, so or back towards where we're viewing it from, and I'm going to start looking at the tops of these hills. I want to add a little bit of an edge highlight on sort of on the crest of these hills, and that's going to help separate the hills from one another a little bit more, but also give some variance as well. So it looks like the far side of these hills, the other side of the hills from us, is obviously completely exposed to the sunlight, and a little bit of that light is kind of washing over the crest of the hill where we can see it. The objects I placed on the hill, the little fence and this dead tree, I've added on here so that we can actually pick up some additional detail in the scene, and so I'm adding some highlights for the sunlight on this tree as well. The far side of this tree, because it's so exposed, would be completely illuminated. So what we're seeing here is just a bit of that illumination kind of creeping around the edges or around the sides of the tree trunk and the branches. So we're just getting a little bit of a suggestion of that. One of the things we've got to do here, because of the pinkish tone of the hill, is make some adjustments to the tone of the light so that we can actually see the light against the hill, because they're sort of both warm colors, a yellow and a sort of a salmony pink. So that's something that you can kind of play around with and adjust a little bit. I probably could have pushed that highlight a little bit more into a white color, but it's still working as it is. You can see I've kind of increased the brightness of this particular yellow because I'm working with a darker color underneath. So essentially here I'm just painting in a little bit of a detail on the fence and the wire. It's so small that you could probably do without it, but it can sometimes, depending on the size of the screen you're viewing it at, it can actually be a little bit visible, so it adds a little bit of detail. So, every so often I'll turn all my layers on and double check what I'm doing, and so I'm moving forward again, and now what I'm doing is adding some little highlights onto these little ripples in the ground, like the little sand ripples. And once again, I'm paying attention to the angle that the sun's coming in. So these ones that you can see here, I've only highlighted the left-hand side of them because the sun is to the left. The ripples that are on the ground directly under the sun, I've highlighted all the way across the top. Same with the fence, the highlights go towards the sun, and then I'm using the blending modes to drop them down. And all of this has just been done literally with a brush, paint brush, so there's nothing sort of special going on here. It's just color, brush, blending mode, and some opacity perhaps. I am making sure that I'm setting the layers, each layer that I'm painting on, I make a new highlight layer for each object, and I clip that layer onto the group, so that way it affects the entire set of layers for example, the plant. With this one, I'm working on the rocks, and I'm just adding in a little bit of more of a white tone. It's like an off-white pinky tone that I'm adding in, and what I did there was use the marquee selection by control clicking the leaf layer thumbnail, and then inverting that selection so that I can't paint over the top of the leaf. So then when I paint the highlight in, it basically goes around the leaf and not over the top of it. And then just using those highlights to refine the shape and bring some of the three-dimensionality of those rocks out again. So with the plants, what I'm doing is control or command clicking the thumbnail for the main layer for the plant, for the leaf, so that it selects. And then when I paint the highlights in, it won't go outside of the leaf. So it's sort of similar to working in a clipping mask or a clipping layer, except it's using the selection to control it. One of the things I want to play around with as well, which I mentioned in a previous video, is potentially playing around with the idea of some sort of translucency on those leaves. So getting shadows casting from the leaves behind to be visible through the leaf. So that'll be something that I might play around with when I'm adding the shading.